The soldiers' hands were trembling, but not from fear. It was exhaustion, the kind that turns your bones into lead and makes your vision blur. And he knew that if he closed his eyes for even a second, he'd collapse right there in the mud. Then, from the breast pocket of his uniform, he pulled out a small white pill. He didn't hesitate, swallowed dry. An hour later, he was charging through the French countryside, screaming orders, firing bursts from his MP40 without missing a beat. His legs didn't ache anymore. His lungs burned, but it was the kind of burn that made him feel alive. The enemy didn't seem like men. They were just moving targets. He felt invincible, unstoppable, hungry for more. That pill had a name, Pervitin, and it was about to change the way war was fought. It wasn't caffeine. It wasn't some herbal tonic. It was methamphetamine, pure pharmaceutical-grade crystal meth, produced in the millions by the Nazi war machine and handed out to soldiers like candy. By 1940, the Wehrmacht had issued over 35 million tablets to its troops. The idea was simple. No sleep, no fear, no hesitation. A perfect soldier. It worked, at least at first. During the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that stunned Europe, entire divisions pushed through enemy lines for days without rest. Infantry marched 50, sometimes 60 kilometers a day. Tank crews stayed alert for 48 hours straight, never blinking, never slowing. Pilots flew mission after mission without needing to land for sleep. War was supposed to be about endurance and discipline. Now it was about chemical superiority. But the miracle had a cost. In the field, soldiers started showing strange symptoms. Some became reckless, charging into enemy fire as if bullets couldn't touch them. Others grew paranoid, convinced their own comrades were plotting against them. A few collapsed mid-attack, hearts giving out under the strain. Official reports brushed it off as combat stress. But the truth was darker. These were the side effects of meth coursing through every nerve. One private, riding home from the front, described it bluntly. "I don't feel tired. I don't feel hungry. I don't even feel human anymore." And Germany wasn't alone. Soon, other armies were taking notice. The British began issuing Benzedrine to bomber crews who needed to stay awake for 12-hour night raids over enemy cities. The Americans followed, handing out their own go pills to paratroopers before D-Day. The Japanese gave meth to kamikaze pilots before their final missions. Not to calm them, but to make them ferocious, focused, and fearless until the very last second. The logic was as brutal as the drug itself. War demanded killers, not survivors. And in the chaos of 20th century combat, morality had no place. Some soldiers loved it. They spoke of the clarity, the endless energy, the way time seemed to slow down so they could aim more precisely, react faster. Others knew it was wrong. They could feel the emptiness that followed, the crash that left them shaking and hollow. But in the middle of a battlefield, what mattered wasn't tomorrow. It was now. By the end of 1940, Pervitin wasn't just a tool. It was part of the strategy. Blitzkrieg wasn't possible without it. Long-range bombing missions would have failed without Benzedrine. Kamikaze attacks would have been less precise, less deadly, without the rush of methamphetamine. What no one could predict was how quickly these pills would turn from combat enhancers into something far more dangerous. How they would twist the minds of soldiers, blur the line between courage and cruelty, and leave a trail of destruction that didn't end when the war did. Because once the killing stopped, the craving didn't. If you're into the untold truths of war, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and share your thoughts in the comments, because what comes next isn't in your school history books. By 1941, Pervitin had become as essential to a German soldier as his rifle. Official Wehrmacht supply lists placed the drug alongside ammunition and rations. Field commanders were instructed to hand it out before night marches, before prolonged offensives, before high-risk operations requiring extreme endurance. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just steel and strategy, it was chemistry. The numbers were staggering. Between April and June 1940 alone, during the invasion of France, German medical officers distributed over 35 million doses. The instructions were precise. 2 tablets for alertness, another after 6 hours if needed, but not more than 3 per day. Advice often ignored in the chaos of battle. Soldiers would chew handfuls before an attack, eyes wide, hands steady, nerves deadened to fear. Across the Channel, Britain was quietly doing the same. RAF bomber crews were given benzodrine sulfate tablets before night raids over Germany. Flying a Lancaster for 10 hours in total darkness, through flak and searchlights, demanded more than coffee. Official memos described the pills as anti-fatigue tablets, but the airmen called them wakies. They worked too well. Reports surfaced of pilots staying in the cockpit for 36 hours straight, only to collapse upon landing, bodies trembling like machines running out of oil. The United States Army Air Forces joined in soon after entering the war. Go pills were issued to bomber crews, reconnaissance pilots, and even infantry officers. One American flyer later admitted, "You didn't just stay awake. You stopped caring about staying alive." For commanders, that was the point. In the Pacific, the Japanese took it further. Their own military-grade methamphetamine, known as Philippon, was administered not just to keep soldiers awake, but to make them aggressive. Kamikaze pilots were given doses before their final flights. Infantry units storming islands received them before battle, their eyes glassy, their movements mechanical, their bayonets driven with unnatural force. But with the victories came whispers. A German medic wrote in his diary about soldiers who couldn't stop grinding their teeth until they cracked. British officers reported aircrew bursting into sudden fits of rage, smashing instruments mid-flight. In the Pacific, Japanese troops in withdrawal would sometimes turn on civilians, not from orders, but from a drug-fueled paranoia that made them see enemies in every face. And yet, none of it stopped. If anything, it escalated. When battles stretched beyond expectations, commanders increased dosages. In Stalingrad, surrounded German troops relied on Pervitin not just to fight, but to stay alive in the freezing ruins, scavenging food and ammunition without sleep for days. On the Burma front, British and Indian soldiers on benzodrine pushed through jungle marches that should have been impossible, but left behind a trail of collapsed men when the pills wore off. Propaganda painted these soldiers as heroes. The truth was uglier. Many were chemically sustained instruments of war, bodies and minds driven beyond human limits until they broke. The line between endurance and insanity was razor thin, and getting thinner with every pill. The high command in every army knew the risks. They just didn't care. As one U.S. military memo put it, the potential operational advantages outweigh the possibility of individual harm. It was a perfect storm. Industrial-scale war, industrial-scale drug production, and an endless supply of young men whose lives could be burned up in the name of victory. What began as a secret advantage was turning into a silent epidemic, one that no one planned to treat. And for some soldiers, the most dangerous battles would come after the shooting stopped. They called him Wolf in the unit, not for his cunning, but for the way he moved in combat, always forward, teeth bared, eyes locked on the enemy. In reality, his real name was Obergefreiter Hans Keller, a 23-year-old from Hamburg. On Pervitin, Hans could sprint through machine gun fire as if the bullets weren't real. In one assault on the outskirts of Minsk, he killed 7 Soviet soldiers in under 3 minutes. When it was over, he stood over the bodies, chest heaving, staring into nothing. Hours later, he admitted he couldn't remember pulling the trigger. Hans wasn't an exception. Across the Eastern Front, there were dozens like him. Some became berserkers, soldiers who would run into fortified positions with bayonets, screaming like madmen, high on meth-induced invincibility. Others slipped into a cold, detached state, killing with surgical precision, their emotions switched off entirely. For commanders, this was ideal. For the men themselves, it was the first step into a darkness they couldn't escape. One German field medic recalled a disturbing incident. After a night of heavy fighting near Smolensk, he found a squad huddled in a ruined house, laughing hysterically. They'd been given double doses before the attack. Inside, alongside them, were the bodies of unarmed villagers, shot at close range. No one could explain why it happened. Officially, it was never recorded. Unofficially, the medic knew the truth. They'd crossed the line between soldier and predator. The Allies had their own ghosts. In the skies over Europe, RAF pilot John Jack Halley was famous for flying missions no one else dared attempt. On Benzedrine, he could keep a bomber steady for 14 hours, weaving through flak bursts like a dancer avoiding blades. But on the ground, the cracks showed. Jack once woke up in his bunk, strangling a fellow crewman, convinced he was a German boarding the plane. The man survived. The story never reached the papers. In the Pacific, American Marines storming Tarawa described fellow soldiers charging enemy trenches without orders, hacking at corpses long after the fight was over. In debriefings, many claimed they had no memory of the frenzy, only a buzzing in their skull and a dry metallic taste in their mouths. Both were classic signs of stimulant overdose. And the Japanese? Their kamikaze pilots were the most extreme example. In one documented case, a pilot named Masao Hayashi was given such a high dose of Philipon before takeoff that his pupils dilated until the iris disappeared. He screamed uncontrollably on the runway, trying to fight anyone who approached. The mission was aborted. But Masao never came down. He was found 2 days later wandering the base, muttering about demons in the clouds. These were not isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a strategy that valued immediate victory over human cost. The drugs didn't just sharpen reflexes. They stripped away fear, empathy, and hesitation. In war, those traits might seem like weaknesses. In reality, they were what separated soldiers from killers without conscience. The worst part? The withdrawal. When the adrenaline of battle faded and the chemicals drained from their systems, soldiers crashed hard. Some fell into violent rages, attacking comrades. Others curled up in fetal positions, shivering uncontrollably. A few simply refused to move, staring at the ground for hours as if the world had already ended. One American medic summed it up in his report. They fought like gods for a day, and then they broke like children. By late 1943, the war was still raging, but another kind of fight had begun, one happening inside the minds and bodies of thousands of men. A fight they couldn't win with bullets. The war ended with parades, medals, and speeches about sacrifice and honor. But for many soldiers, the real battle was only beginning. Hans Keller, the Wolf of Minsk, returned to Hamburg in 1945, a hero on paper. In reality, he was a gaunt, restless shell of the man who had left. Without Pervitin, his body shook constantly. He couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. The nightmares came every night. Flashes of muzzle fire, screaming voices, faces he couldn't recognize. His family thought he was haunted by war. In truth, he was in withdrawal, the chemical hooks of methamphetamine tearing at his nervous system. British pilot Jack Halley fared no better. Back in London, he took a civilian flying job, but colleagues noticed his hands trembling on the controls. Without Benzedrine, he felt slower, heavier, like I'm dragging myself through water. Within months, he was buying pills on the black market just to function. In 1947, he was found dead in his flat, the coroner listing heart failure as the cause. No mention was made of the years of sanctioned military drug use that had primed his body for collapse. In America, veterans returned from the Pacific with violent mood swings, bursts of paranoia, and an unshakable restlessness. Many couldn't hold steady jobs. Some turned to crime. Others simply disappeared into the growing shadows of post-war cities. The official term was combat fatigue, a neat, clinical phrase that hid the fact that thousands were dealing with stimulant addiction and long-term brain damage. Japan's post-war reckoning was darker still. In the years following surrender, warehouses full of Philippon, once reserved for soldiers and kamikaze pilots, flooded the civilian market. By 1950, an estimated 500,000 Japanese civilians were addicted. The government called it a public health crisis. The irony was bitter. A drug designed to fuel death in war was now quietly killing in peacetime. Governments on all sides knew the truth. They had the medical reports, the diaries of field doctors, the after-action memos describing erratic behavior, sudden deaths, and psychological collapse. But acknowledging it would mean admitting they had knowingly sacrificed the long-term health of their own men. So they buried it. In archives, the files were stamped classified and left to gather dust. Publicly, they spoke only of bravery and sacrifice. Some military doctors tried to speak out. In 1946, a German physician testified during a denazification hearing that Pervitin is as dangerous as any enemy weapon and should be banned entirely. His words never made the newspapers. In Britain, RAF medical officers circulated a confidential memo warning that long-term use of Benzedrine may produce permanent mental impairment. The memo vanished into Ministry of Defense files, unseen for decades. The logic of the silence was simple. War is fought for victory, not for the long-term well-being of its fighters. To the generals, the soldiers had done their duty. The damage they carried home was not the Army's concern. And yet, in the dark corners of veterans' hospitals, the truth festered. Men who had once stormed beaches and flown bombing runs now sat shaking in chairs, staring at walls, unable to explain why they felt like part of themselves had been burned away. The pills had given them superhuman endurance, yes, but they had also hollowed them out from the inside, leaving only the shell. What none of them knew was that, even as they suffered, military scientists in multiple countries were already preparing for the next war and the next generation of enhanced soldiers. The lessons of the Opioids weren't to avoid such drugs. They were to refine them. By the 1950s, the uniforms had changed, the flags were different, but the science of war hadn't slowed. In secret laboratories from Washington to Moscow, military doctors refined the same principle that had powered the Blitzkrieg and fueled kamikaze pilots. A soldier who doesn't need sleep, doesn't feel fear, and doesn't question orders is the perfect weapon. The Korean War saw the reappearance of pep pills in American supply kits. In Vietnam, pilots were routinely issued dexedrine, a close chemical cousin to the meth that had fueled Wehrmacht. Official briefings used the same euphemisms as before: combat alertness tablets, anti-fatigue aids. Unofficially, veterans would later say the pills kept them alive on missions that lasted 2, sometimes 3 days without rest. The side effects? The same as in the 1940s: paranoia, sudden violence, hallucinations. Only this time, the military didn't even pretend it was an accident. Even today, in modern conflicts, the legacy remains. In 2002, during the Afghanistan War, Canadian soldiers killed 4 of their own in a friendly fire incident after a bombing run. The pilots involved had been issued amphetamines before the mission. Official investigations called them "go pills," the same nickname used by W-12 bomber crews more than half a century earlier. The technology of warfare had leapt forward. The chemistry had not. The truth is brutal. The armies of the world learned nothing from the shattered men who came home from W-12. Or rather, they learned the wrong lesson, not to stop, but to hide it better. Modern stimulants are designed to leave the bloodstream faster, to be less traceable, but their effect is the same. Push the body beyond its limits, strip away fear and hesitation, and leave the cleanup for later. And the soldiers, they are still paying the price. Veterans' hospitals in multiple countries treat cases of treatment-resistant depression, chronic anxiety, and severe insomnia that trace back to deployment. Many of these men and women were never told exactly what they had been given. The file says, "performance enhancers." The reality is far less clinical. What began in W-12 as an experiment in endurance has become a permanent feature of war. The weapons change, rifles become drones, tanks become missiles. But the logic remains the same. Break the human limits, win the fight, and ignore the wreckage left behind. There's a photograph in the German Federal Archives, rarely shown in textbooks. It's of a young soldier in France, 1940. He's grinning wide, eyes shining, jaw tight. To most viewers, he looks like the picture of confidence. But to anyone who knows the history, that look is unmistakable. Pupils blown wide, adrenaline in overdrive, mind racing at 100 miles an hour. It's the face of a man who feels unstoppable, right before the fall. The tragedy of combat drugs isn't just what they did in battle. It's that 80 years later, we're still willing to make the same trade. Human lives for short-term advantage, bodies and minds for a few more hours of firepower. If you made it this far, subscribe, like, and drop a comment. Because these aren't just stories about the past. They're warnings about the future. And the next time you see a soldier in the field, know this: the war they're fighting might not be the only one inside them.